Oh, okay. Welcome back, humans of the internet, to It's Not Just in Your Head. Today, Harriet and I are going to answer some patron questions. Some of our patrons sent us questions they wanted us to answer on the podcast, and so that's what we're going to do. And the first question is by Morgan, and Morgan asks, or let's see, they say, my question is about libertarianism. In what reality can people think that more capitalism, unchecked and unregulated, is going to help anyone except those at the top? And this leads me to question what kind of government is best? And also, what do I say to these people? Meaning, what do I say to libertarians?
Well, that's a good question. One of the things that gets libertarians where they are is that they don't really want to see the mass suffering caused by capitalism, or they don't care about it. And what you can say is, I'm not quoting religion to find an absolute right or wrong. But let's
Mm,
see where each decision leads. If you decide that the government won't intervene at all, then of course capitalists would be in bad shape. The oil industry wouldn't get their oil depletion allowance. They wouldn't get their lobbyists to pass legislation that favors them. And the people at the bottom wouldn't have a voice either. So that it's silly to say that you should let capitalism do what it wants. It never and let everyone else do what they want. The government has been a tool of those who can control it. It's been a tool of the wealthy from the beginning of our Constitution, when only 6% of people could in the United States could vote, because they had to be white, they had to be male, and they had to have money. They had to pay the poll tax.
mm.
So, and property. So let's, from the very beginning, money talks in our government. And the libertarians are in denial of our history on that one.
Mm.
And if you want to say, where does it lead? You'd have to look at the chaos and destruction of where it leads. The wealthy can buy armies, the poor can't. It's crazy. It's a crazy position that's in denial of our history and our present.
And do you know what that principle is called? I can't think of it offhand. It's like the not the nonviolent principle, but it's they use, because you could say slavery times, when slavery was totally a-okay within
Right?
American economic and
Capitalism.
cultural society. You could say, well, technically that's a little bit more libertarian than what we have today on some level, right? But they would say, well, no, 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 because we as libertarians have this, I'm just forgetting what it's called, but it's like no threat or no harm principle or something. It's sort of like a do unto others or some kind of thing like that. It's like a principle. But then I'm like, okay, so if we're not going to have
Principles do
stru-
no harm. Is that it?
that's a that's a good way of putting it. Like, just so just having principles not do harm. It's
Mm-hmm.
some kind of like no harm principle. But like, this idea that, like, I mean, let's say you get 100 people in a village, or like in a township or something, and you just say, let's just have this sort of free for all. There's no government, there's no rules. We're just sort of agreeing to not do bad, and we're sort of agreeing to do good. And maybe there'll be some sort of vigilante justice if someone violates a principle or an agreement. We'll just sort of figure out how to do that. I mean, I think the libertarian philosophy is attractive in the sense that, and just to sort of validate the position, I suppose, if you've seen government bureaucracy go wrong, if you've
Mm.
seen uh, overly structured governance processes, whether it's government or labor unions or worker co-ops, or, I mean, really anything, I could see you building up enough frustration where you go like, why can't we just do what we want? Why can't we just be free or whatever? And I get the sentiment, but I think it's more reactionary than anything else, because in grown up land, we have to kind of sit through some procedural, structured, organized, um, uh, meetings, and actually have like enforcement processes. Uh, we can't just rely on, well, if we just agree to not harm each other, and we all just are free and we just do whatever we want, kind of thing. It's just, I don't think it doesn't really add up uh,
No.
at all. The other thing is, um, I mean, the question of what, Morgan's asking what kind of government is best, and I think it's kind of hard to answer that because I think it's also kind of situation by situation and group by group. Um, like I like this idea of if we could redesign the entire economy, even on a global scale, to like a whole bunch of interconnected, federated worker co-ops and housing co-ops and stuff. Like I like that idea. I don't know how we get to where we are now to that. Like I think that'd be a good governance system, and like worker councils and tenant and neighborhood councils and all that um, are governing with governmental structures that maybe have some sort of enforcement processes. I don't know if that's police or something else. But there's a lot of debates on the left about this, and there's nobody has the absolute best answer. But I don't know, Harriet, maybe you have the best answer. I don't know.
I don't know if I have the best, but what I can see is an interlocking set of co ops. And I can see that every structure
Mm-hmm.
not only has top down evaluation, but bottom up evaluation, that everyone has to be evaluated by and for the people they're supposed to serve, rather than
Mm-hmm.
the top down power positions we have now. I also think that you can't say just do good, not bad, because some people think it's good. Accumulating more for me, that is the greatest good. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
That's Bezos and his ilk. Other people have different other ideas of what's good. But I think we have to see what connects people the most, what gives the maximum number of people a say. And I think we could look to the community of Mondragon in Spain, which is an interlocking system of co ops with a cooperative government. No one can make more than 6 to 8 times more than anyone else. All offices are elected, and everyone has a say in smaller councils that go to a larger elected body, which can be impeached at any minute. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's democracy because you can't have
Mm-hmm.
political democracy without economic democracy. And the
Yeah,
greatest democracy, for me, is the greatest good.
I completely agree with that sentiment, and would also say that I think the libertarian fantasy is pretty couched in extreme individualism as
Mm.
well, like this fantasy, this sort of delusional idea that we're individuals and the smallest unit of humanity is the individual, and if we as individuals are just sort of, again, principled and following agreements, and you don't have to like use structures and processes within circles and like interlinking circles of governance, then like things will just sort of work out well. I just don't think that again, like historically, human beings didn't evolve as individuals; they evolved through social structures as tribes for like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, which gave rise to larger and larger social organization. So this idea of like individuals just kind of doing stuff as individuals to me is just not like it's not an accurate or helpful way of thinking about human beings either. But
It's also just
that's
not
me.
developmentally sound. Individuals are
Right.
created socially. Everyone is a social creature. People don't even learn how to talk without a social network. The
Mm-hmm.
wild children who, just like Hansel and Gretel wrote about, parents used to leave kids they didn't want in the woods. And some of them became adopted by animals, and they were animals. They moved their hands like the animals moved their ears. They picked up the
Mm-hmm.
cues. We start out with a brain that's tiny, the size of a little apple. We end up with a Nerf football sized brain, and it's all
Mm-hmm.
social connections. That's how we learn. Socially, we learn what's good, what's bad, who we are, who we aren't. We're socially embedded animals. We are the most socially embedded animals. We develop the most slowly to independence. The next, I think, in line are elephants, 2 years of dependency on their parents, not
Mm-hmm.
humans. We are social. So the idea that we are these fully formed individuals is silly and biologically and psychologically and scientifically inaccurate.
Absolutely. And I guess we don't have to spend all our time on Morgan's,
No.
but the newer brain science, interpersonal neurobiology, I find really
Yes,
fascinating.
it
The
is.
study of how our brains are co-regulating and co-shaping each other, and the attachment science that's linked to interpersonal neurobiology now is really, really fascinating. That there's if you're like a real if you're a STEM or sciencey nerd, probably beyond like my intelligence level, there's some look up Alan Shore and Dan Siegel and some
Mm,
other neuroscience nerds who've been really developing this branch of psychological science. And it's essentially that like when that baby is born with that tiny brain, they're the circuits within their brain are actually being shaped by, is there consistent eye contact and mirroring of facial expressions between
mm,
mother or other caregiver and that child? What is being mirrored or not mirrored, and what is being modeled by and in a relational way, in a connective and attachment based way with the other human beings within their environment? And that shapes what their attachment style might be later. Like, do they feel safe around people? Do they feel unsafe around people? Do they trust versus mistrust and all of that? And that's determined by the relationship. And
mm,
there just is no, and if you were to try to put a baby, just I don't know, just put a baby in a box somewhere and go raise yourself, like, they would die. But even if you just gave them, I don't know, milk and food or whatever, and you didn't give them nurturing and love and attention, their brains would not develop properly, and they would not be able to function as an intelligent or adaptive human being. So it just goes back to, again, like, we need each other, not just in this sort of woo woo hippie way. Like, we're not talking about it just as therapists or as like social science people. We're talking about it on a biological and survival level. We actually do need each other, um, or we die. So,
yes.
so yeah, libertarianism's a bit weird to me.
Yes, indeed.
So,
So thank
should
you
we
for your
jump?
question.
Yeah, thank you, Morgan.
And
Um,
thank you for being on Patreon because we depend on you. And thank you so much for your contributions.
Yeah, thank you so much. The next one, they didn't want their name, so their
Good.
name is Anonymous. Anonymous human patron says, one thing I'd be interested in hearing about is your take on the different types of benefits that different people can get from talk therapy, particularly in terms of your personal experiences with clients. Not sure how to fit that into a Marxist perspective, but if you could think, let's see, but if you could, I think it would be sweet. I really like that aspect of the show too.
Well, that's a very good question. And talk therapy, of course, has so many different manifestations and possibilities. You can talk in hypnosis, you could talk when you do eye movement, rapid desensitization, or other techniques. The idea, and I think it were everyone who has made a commitment to therapy with me has gotten better. Of course, I don't see the homeless insane, so that's out of my sample. However, the idea of talk therapy is someone recognizes you. You have to have a therapist that cares. Someone recognizes you. Someone cares about you. Someone is just there to help you know yourself. And for a lot of people, nobody's ever been in that position, including parents. And so that is a healing relationship because people heal not only from techniques, but from relationship, and a relationship in which someone's whole energy
Mm-hmm.
and vocabulary is focused on helping you know yourself is a healing experience. And that's why I think talk therapy works for
Mm-hmm.
everybody who I've seen who's been serious about putting the time in.
I would say so too, with far less experience than Harriet has in this field. I'm like 5 years into it. Harriet, you're what, like
45.
decades,
Yeah.
45 years into it. So I have a lot less insights from the clinical work. But I'd say, I don't want to say everyone I've ever worked with. I mean, also, the vast majority of my experience was in community mental health with low income, often like immigrant families with just multi problems of like a lot of material, like poverty caused problems that I think actually deepened my politics in realizing like we need housing
Mm.
and healthcare and education and childcare programs, because a lot of these people just, if we had those, like the strong welfare state in place, they wouldn't even be seeking mental health services because these aren't
Right.
actually mental health issues so much as like they're like material need issues that aren't being met, and then they're trying to cope along those lines. Um, so that's maybe that's a whole different thing. But well, then again, I think if you are a single mom, dad's locked up for whatever he was doing, you have three kids, you're begging grandma and the auntie to come over and try to help you like take care of the kids with you, and you work two jobs, all these insanely stressful things that you can say are like producing quote unquote mental health problems for this kind of mother, like young mother, single mother. um, I've seen benefit, like just the relief of someone like that in that position, talking to someone for an hour a week and getting that validation and feeling understood and kind of soaking in compassion from another human being. I think really can make a difference, even though it can't get them childcare and healthcare
Mm.
and affordable housing and all of that. Um, and maybe differentiating between say the micro and the macro. What we do is it's very like sort of macro level in that sense. But I think sometimes people come away with, whether it's insights or maybe this is the interpersonal neurobiology stuff, that there's something that just sort of clicks in their brains or something. Maybe there's a biological thing, or they learn to self validate to the point where they can like regulate their own emotions and they feel confident in their own communication skills with other people in their lives, that actually can get them in a position to improve the material conditions.
Mm.
I couldn't give you like absolute proof of whether or not this is how it works, but I do think there are some cases where that exact thing does happen. And in other cases, I think sometimes like it's not a perfect therapeutic fit. um, Sometimes people, kind of like what Harriet's saying, people are committed and they like really do it, they make time, they reliably show up on time every week or whatever the frequency of the meetings are. I think most people like that do get benefits. Some people, they just can't. They're either too afraid of the process, or they're, I don't know, maybe they're too busy, or maybe they feel weirded out by you after the third session. They stop coming back. I mean, there's that happens too. But um, one thing I struggle with a little bit sometimes is from that Marxist perspective. Sometimes people, these aren't perfect generalizations, but the one distinction is, liberals are idealists, leftists are materialists, right? It's not a perfect distinction,
No.
but the liberal in the very well-to-do neighborhood that puts up the Black Lives Matter sign on their front lawn saying, "I did a social change," and the leftist who says we need to get there and organize to change the police system, the housing system, the healthcare system in service of Black lives kind of orientation. That'd be like, we need to change the material conditions. I struggle sometimes just wondering, like, is what we do not like materialist enough? Is it not, pushing for those material condition changes? Um, but I don't think it's an either or, in part because of what we just talked about for like the brain stuff in kids and in relationships. I think there's something. I mean, Marx probably. I actually haven't read enough Marx to know, but I don't think Marx probably didn't understand the degree of importance in relationships and the materiality that's actually connected to
Right.
that. Like he just wasn't thinking in those terms, as far as I
No, he
understand.
wasn't, and he was
So,
before Freud too. He wasn't
right,
affected by psychology. But I
yeah,
think the most important thing is that therapy is liberation on a personal level. And one of
mm,
the things it can show you is that which you did not know was possible is that self which you didn't know was there is that you
mm,
can become empowered, which is a political and material effect. And being in one
mm,
course of liberation gives you the idea that liberation is possible, and therefore they are connected
mm.
irrevocably.
Oh, last thing I'll say on this is that I'm a big fan of group therapy as well, and I I wish that group therapy were more normalized in the talk therapy world, because there's a
Mm,
lot of strong evidence for its effectiveness. I think it's probably a combination of just the difficulty of getting a lot of people in the same place, or even right now it's like on Zoom. And but what's his name? Irving Yalom? Is that the guy?
hmm
Yeah, the group guy. He wrote like the basically like a Bible on like group therapy, and all the research and everything. And that's where that concept. What are those concepts? It's forming. You know this better than me. Forming, storming.
Mhm.
norming performing or something like that.
Yes.
Like these phases that groups tend to go through where like first people like meet and they're in a group and things are okay. And then there's some conflict and then like I actually forget the exact degree, what the exact four are in that linear sense. But there's stuff I think within groups, like in group therapy is harder to perform. You have to be a really good facilitator and be on your toes. But I think that's another really cool therapy approach that
Mm.
people can get a lot of benefit out of. And since Harriet and I are talking about, we like the idea of co-ops in an entirely cooperativized economy. I think that if somehow we normalized group therapy as
Mm.
a more normal part of the therapy world, it'd probably assist uh, workers in being able to actually engage in sort of democratic processes within workplaces, within unions, within other, I don't know, DSA meetings or something like that, just from the group process as well. But maybe that's like a whole topic we could cover another time of like research on group therapy or something like that.
The only thing that I would want to add before
Mm-hmm.
we need to move on to another response is that the most successful program in the United States by far are the 12-step programs, which are group therapy.
And that's, yeah, I think we should do a whole topic on that sometime.
Yes, we
I
should.
think I think the key to that is the peer to peer
Hmm.
thing as well, right? That it's not experts, it's not professionals, it's ordinary folks
In
who,
your same sinking
right?
boat who help keep you afloat. It's
Yeah, yeah.
and it is
Hmm.
very popular in every tiny little town, no matter where there's an AA.
That's a good segue for Jake's question, and
Good.
I'm gonna say, Jake, thank you for this extremely well thought out and quite wordy question. That was like, I'm not going to read the whole thing for us because it would take really long. It deserves like its own like hour long response, I feel. But so it's, well, I'll read parts of it and then I'll get to the questions at the bottom. So Jake writes to us, the topic is capitalism and addiction, specifically how it affects and defines the modern addiction treatment industry. I'm a person in long term recovery from addiction, have spent some time being a participant and employee of treatment centers and transitional living homes. And Jake kind of describes some of the details in there, talking about in these programs there'll be a therapist, there'll be rides to 12-step meetings, but then they talk about the cost. Like most centers charge upwards of 30,000 a month. Um, and then gets into this other kind of related issue of what's called the troubled teen industry. Similar situation, a residential transitional living program costs $9,800 a month with 6 months required. So, and then the owner takes 30K of profit a month while paying starting employees around 13 an hour. So those would be, uh, you know, lead mentors, case managers. There's kind of different positions of sort of mental health or rehab specialist types of jobs, case managers, social workers. And he kind of goes into as well like the wilderness therapy world. So he's painting actually, I think, a very good picture of a network of mental health industry, um, kind of like business models that are interlinking, and the tensions and the contradictions within them of like, they're obviously pretty helpful for people who participate in these programs.
Sometimes.
Probably, yeah. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And they have this like hierarchical structure, and they're very expensive and inaccessible. So he just kind of lays out that whole thing, then asks the following questions. Addiction is often viewed as an individual problem of willpower rather than a societal ill encouraged by political and economic conditions. How do such conditions affect addiction? And before we answer that, he has a couple other ones. Maybe we can just answer the
Answer
soup.
that one.
The answer this well. There's a soup of questions. So we'll just kind of latch on to whichever we find most that calls to us. Another question is, why does the US in particular have a disproportionately large number of both drug users and abstinence based drug treatment facilities? How do other countries, including those with different economic systems, respond to addiction? Another question is, and more to the troubled teen industry stuff, how does capitalism and corrupt government affect the mental health of today's teens and youth? and are there more equitable alternatives to treat addiction and troubled teens? So wherever you want to go with that, Harriet.
Okay, well, the first thing is where profit is involved, it's usually the main uh, reason that people are in it. And the main focus is making money rather than restoring people's mental health, which is not a good idea. And we have a huge addiction problem because the greater problems go with the greater inequality in society. The more people feel they haven't got a chance, they're in debt, they have nothing to look forward to, they change the way the world looks like to them by taking a drug that changes, that alters their vision and alters their emotional climate. And we are the most unequal of all the Western industrialized and developed countries, and we have a huge drug addiction problem. And
Mm,
we could, to give a brief answer, because I think that covers a lot of the question,
yeah. Yeah.
Portugal is a very good example of how to deal with drugs. Portugal, although it isn't advertised much in our newspapers or talked about, has been ruled for many years by a coalition of the Green Party, the Communist Party, and the Socialist Party. And they have a program for addiction which has been adopted by Uruguay and others, which is that all drugs are free. Vans go around and they offer people, they sell people drugs at a regulated price that are clean. People aren't injecting rat poison into their veins and allow people to function. They also give everyone who buys a drug an option to also get free treatment, which is paid for by the amount of money they get from selling the drugs.
Mm,
And they went from an addict out of every 10 people, they went down 75% with this program. And so that there are many fewer addicts. And those that are addicts are a lot healthier because they're not injecting poison into their veins and they're
mm,
more functional. And that's a model that seems to work, that pays for itself, it pays for its treatment, and is humane.
mm,
And I also think it's helped by the fact that Portugal's green socialist communist government is much
mhm,
more just and equitable and giving opportunities for many more than their long term dictatorship did.
mhm. And I just to throw another little factor in here as well, if you think about the disproportionality of people of color who get criminalized and then just kind of thrown into the prison industrial complex, factory, just kind of just ruins a lot of people's lives, or just makes life a lot harder for the rest of their lives for drug related offenses.
Mm,
There is some research on, like, if you're a black or brown youth, you they throw you in a juvenile hall. Juvenile
mm,
hall leads to certain issues. Now you have the school to prison pipeline kind of thing. If you're a white kid, you get thrown into rehabs. And I think class probably maybe would predict better for race on
mm,
this, and that the dollar signs that Jake referred to is speaking to, in the U.S., because of the profit model and because of
mm,
our terrible welfare state condition. Rich parents can send their kids off to these wilderness behavioral modification camps and whatever. I mean, rich people out of Hollywood
mm,
can afford to send themselves off to like a 6-week intensive rehab program or whatever. Um, but everybody else, if they're lucky, they don't get locked up for whatever they're doing,
mm,
or whatever the addiction is leading them to do, which is usually kind of like shitty criminal behaviors instead of just, I don't know, stealing from people to get more heroin and all kinds of terrible things. So if you're lucky, you don't get locked up, and if you're lucky, you find a 12-step program around, and maybe that'll help. But then with your life falling apart, there's all these issues. So there's sort of some disparity, inequality stuff that I think it answers the question of, like, why in particular is the US so bad with this stuff. I think it's just that our capitalism is so hardcore,
mm.
and our social programs are so poor, and that the profit motive is built into even the mental health industry itself, which we've spoken about a bit before too. And I agree with everything Harriet said. Insofar as Portugal, I know in Canada they have some, Gabor Mate is,
Mm,
it seems like he's kind of famous now because of the initial work that he was doing in like a
yes.
legalized heroin clinic. And he spoke a lot too. This is a related issue, and it kind of goes back to the interpersonal neurobiology and attachment disruption stuff as well, because he often talks about the intergenerational trauma that leads to addictions, that most hardcore addicts, if he meets a hardcore addict who's an adult, that it's he's almost never seen an addict who didn't have a really severe trauma history going back to
Mm,
their early childhood. And so there's something that happens, like that your neurobiology just gets really disrupted, the circuits that develop your empathy and your impulse control and your cognitive abilities and your emotion regulation and all of that gets really severely disrupted when there's a lot of trauma or neglect or whatever when you're a little kid. And over time, if you find drugs and alcohol, if they appear in your life and you try them and you say, well, this makes me feel a lot better. And that's kind of where addictions come from. So, yeah, I think removing the criminality, that would almost be like the rent control. It's like rent control doesn't make housing affordable, but it stops the bleeding. So, like,
mm,
gentrification isn't so bad. If you like stopped the criminality within the addict world, you could at least stop people from having to get locked up for all these things. And then from there, maybe you could start talking about better treatment programs. But then I think the prevention piece has to be talked about too, because if that goes back to like childhood trauma, you then have to talk about the various things that Harriet's always talking about, which is that the economic decline in the US over the last 50 to 70 years has resulted in families not being able to attend to their children or stay together,
mm,
or pay for basic needs, and then being overworked and not being able to attend to their kids leads to higher stress, which leads to higher kind of like substance abuse and child abuse and all those kinds of things. So there is, I think, a holistic conversation about what a healthier, more democratized, equitable economy looks like, plays into ongoing treatment of whatever problems are going on in terms of addiction, as well as prevention of the more severe forms of child abuse and
mm,
neglect, which predict for higher rates of addiction later.
mm. So that so we have tried to address your concerns.
Yeah,
I'm
and well,
glad you
thank you, Jake.
wrote.
It's a
Okay.
great, it's a complicated question, and hopefully we answered that sufficiently. We do have one more from Morgan, and Morgan
Mm,
is the same. Morgan has sent us two questions, and other patrons who are listening, please do send us your questions, because we actually didn't get as many as we thought we would, but we could address Morgan's second question. So Morgan says, and Morgan's from Kentucky, so
mm,
hello again, Morgan.
yes.
Morgan says, I'm a super sensitive person, someone whose empathy is both a blessing and a curse.
Mm,
I've had to learn boundaries with friends and family recently in order to protect my energy. All woo woo aside, the weight of the world has felt overwhelming to the point recently where I feel drained and depleted. How can I draw the line? I want to be aware and active in this world to work against the system, but how do I keep it from drowning me?
well, one of the things, Morgan, that's very important is to be compassionate for you as well as other people. If you don't survive, you're not so much good to anybody, including yourself, but also to all the people and all the causes you want to help. So you always need to know that there are two things that you need to balance. You need to balance your sense of justice and your need to survive. Bertolt Brecht has the famous communist playwright who really he was enormously celebrated, wrote after World War II and during and before. At any rate, he has these little fables, and one of them is about an imaginary character who's on a very scary mountain road, and he commits a crime against himself. He lets his cigar go out, which means he didn't have that little bit of critical distance from what's going on to be able to keep calm. And I think when you care, you can get totally soaked up in the tragedy
Mm-hmm.
around you and forget that you're a person and you need too. And everyone's needs, including yours, are valid. no matter what's going on in the world.
That's a beautiful answer. I will say, as someone who half jokingly identifies as half empath, half sociopath, which is not the greatest way of describing this, is that I find that I can lean into kind of both sides. Like I can lean into overly soaking in other people's emotions and then second guessing myself and all of that whole spiral, and also setting those, just sort of clicking something inside, just saying like I'm not going to deal with this shit, kind of. And that's something that it's kind of a skill I had to develop over time. And I know people that kind of identify as more empaths and they're just absorbing everything all the time. I think that's one of the hardest things, to just figure out where that boundary, like you're saying, like where that boundary is between like yourself and other people. And like, I think for women especially, it's probably a bigger, just a socialization thing of like,
Mm,
how, to what degree do I need to take care of this other person's needs versus taking care of my own needs? I think, again, stereotypically, we as men are often just told like, well, just take care of your own needs and don't worry about other people, kind of thing. Just like not great. But it's tough because this is something that you kind of, I don't want to say you have to do on your own, but these are skills. It's almost like a mindfulness skill of starting to notice
mm,
when within relationships and social settings and all of that, like at what point are you have to click on some kind of awareness. Like
mm,
at what point am I getting wrapped up in other people's stuff? When am I suddenly becoming sort of a people pleaser or a caretaker, or just sort of absorbing other people's energy? Like if they're angry about something and it has nothing to do with you, or are you starting to feel defensive? If you notice someone's grief, are you suddenly feeling like you're depressed because you're around them? You first have to just notice that it's happening. Then you have to figure out some kind of way, like either to, whether you're going to call it setting a boundary, or like, using a coping skill in like the behavioral world, they would say. um, and I think it's important to, if possible, develop relationships in your life with people who understand you as being that way, and would not frame your way of being as quote unquote overly sensitive, and
mm,
instead just understand that you are someone who feels things deeply and that they value that in you. And
mhm,
maybe they're that way themselves, or they're not that way, but they just recognize like this is a magical part of who Morgan is. And I understand that, and I love that about her. Um, and that's, if you can't do that, I think that's where it's hard, because if everyone around you just thinks you're quote unquote overly sensitive or something like that, I don't know what to do about those people.
yeah, maybe find
It's
other
just too,
friends.
exactly. It's too bad when we're surrounded by people that don't get us.
Mm,
And yeah, and if they're not open to those conversations, that's just a whole other can of worms. Like how do you set boundaries there, find better relationships, etc. It's a difficult project.
it is, but reciprocity is crucial because you too
Hmm.
need to be nurtured. You too have
Hmm.
needs. Even if other people's needs seem searing, you've got to live with yourself psychologically and physically, and you too need
Hmm.
to be remembered
Hmm.
by you as well as others.
Hmm.
So thank you,
Well,
Morgan.
yeah, thank you, Morgan. I think that's it for questions. So,
So, our Patreon members, you could submit questions. We'll address them on, in verbally, if you would prefer a quiet note that's not
hmm,
announced.
hmm.
We'll do that too, because we really appreciate your support. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So feel free. Yeah, like Sariat said, we can reply to you privately. Also, let us know, like someone did, that they didn't want their first or last name, just no name, but they did want to hear an answer verbalized on the podcast. So just they're just anonymous, right? So let us know, like, do you want your name used? Do you not want your name used? Do you want us to just reply privately? We're happy to do whatever feels best for you.
Thank
So,
you.
and anyone else, yeah, thank you. Anyone else listening, if you would like to become a supporter, patron, you can go to patreon.com/, it's not just in your head. And if you just want to shoot us an email and not do the patron thing, you can email us at it's not just in your head at gmail.com. By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life, as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.